So here we have one little piece of a eukaryote. It would be like huge, take up the whole wall. This part is the nucleus, where most of the DNA lives. Not all the DNA. Some things like this mitochondria, they got their own DNA. Okay? But most of the DNA lives in the nucleus. And then we have this little thing, it's a bacteria trying to sneak in and invade. This bacteria is a cell, but it's a prokaryote because see, its DNA, this chromosome, is just floating around there. It doesn't have this nice membrane around it like the eukaryote has. Here, there's just naked chromosomes floating around. Good? Good? Easy enough. Now, in the past, we said kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I want you to know that. I want you to know that in order. How are you going to remember it? King Philip came over for ginger snaps. Yeah. King Philip came over for ginger snaps. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, since then, they came up with the domain. I told you that. So you changed it to did King Philip come over for ginger snaps? Now you got them all. Good? Did King Philip come over for ginger snaps? So what is the domain business about? Why did this happen? No, because some people were like, we used to use the term prokaryote and bacteria interchangeably. So, oh yeah, it's things without a nucleus. And then some people start testing like, hey, you know, the one right here, it's a lot different than the one over here. I mean, its DNA is more similar to the eukaryotes than it is to the other bacteria. Got to call it its own thing. We're going to separate them out. So we used to call it all bacteria, and they're like, oh, these are the true bacteria, and these are the archaebacteria. They're the ones that have the weird, ancient-looking DNA. It looks kind of like eukaryote DNA. Yeah. So we're going to separate them. And they're like, no, they're so different that the things we're now calling eubacteria, we're just going to go back and call them bacteria. And the archaebacteria, they're not even bacteria, they're archaea. They're their own weird thing. Good? Good? All right, and they are weird, trust me. If you have any microbe that does weird stuff, your first bet would be that it's one of those. So what happened is the things we used to call bacteria, they divided up into bacteria and archaea. And like they're so different from each other, we're creating a new level of domain. So they have domain bacteria. It only has one kingdom, and it's called bacteria. Then they have domain archaea. It only has one kingdom, and it's kingdom archaea. And then they have domain, it's got a nucleus. That's eukaryota. And it has all the little microbes that we haven't talked about previously, and all the plants, and all the fungi, and all the animals. It's anything with a nucleus. And by the way, the protista, those microbes with a nucleus, not all of them are microbes. I shouldn't call them that. Protista is mostly microbes, but it also includes things like kelp. Right, Sean, you ever dive kelp forests?
Kelp forests?
Yeah.
They tangled a lot.
Yeah. But it's fun. It's fun.
I got trapped on some line.
I never got trapped on a line in kelp, but I've dove kelp. I spent a summer in Puget Sound, so I was diving bull kelp. Kelp is really interesting. Well, the part that's relevant here is it could get 90 feet tall from the bottom to the surface of the water, from the rocks it's stuck to. That's not a microbe. It's still considered to be a protista because it's an algae type thing. And all the algae are protista. Does that make sense? The thing that you're about to see is that protista is about to get broken again. They're going to make amoebas their own group. Amoebas are a protista. So let's talk about the two types of the prokaryotes, the two types of things without the nucleus. You got your bacteria. They're little cells. They don't have sex. They do asexual reproduction. They don't have a nucleus. You knew that because they're prokaryotes. Their bacterial chromosome is just like this big loop of DNA. They also have these little loops called plasmids, which are going to matter a lot when we do biotech. And that's what bacteria use them for. Bacteria don't have sex, but what they will do, if times are stressed, they'll grow a tube, a conjugation tube, over to another bacteria, and they'll swap plasmids. They're not drawn to scale here. This is small enough, it's like this little pinprick here. Okay? You have this big bacterial chromosome with double-stranded DNA, and then you have little tiny plasmids. What happens is they swap plasmids, and they have different genes. Like this one will get genes it didn't have, and this one will get genes it didn't have. And that might give them what they need to survive. But they don't have any organelles, no mitochondria, no Golgi apparatus, no endoplasmic reticulum, none of the cool stuff. All right. Archaea are like bacteria. They're little like them. They don't have sex, just like them. They don't have a nucleus, we've said that, no organelles. The difference is archaea live in some really messed up, weird places. All right, dermatogen. That means we think they generated. We think they came from places of extreme heat. Well, why do we think that? You know why those ponds are like orange to the outside and yellow to the middle and then green and then blue in the middle? The blue is where nothing lives because it's coming out boiling hot out of the rock. Okay, so it's really hot. Comes out boiling. Nothing can live in the middle. As it cools just a little, you got some things that can live in it. It cools a little more, other species can live in it. It cools a little more, other species can live in it. These hot spring bacteria, they have very special DNA. We'll talk about this later. They let us do something called polymerase chain reaction. And so the enzymes that they have. We saw those enzymes like, oh, we could totally use those in science. And now we use them in biotech all the time. And I will make you hear a horrible song about it. Protect meat from rotting with bacteria. They rubbed salt on it so much it would kill bacteria that tried to get on the meat. Am I right? Okay. They're like, meh, I don't care. They live in stuff so salty it kills everything else. They're like, yeah. And you can tell there's probably a few of them in there. You know, it's not a weak concentration. Oh, it's kind of pink. There's a bunch of them. Good? Good? Yeah. All right, so archaea live in extreme conditions. If you go back to SlothNet and look there from here down, bacteria, how do antibiotics work? They screw with the cell wall, right? Bacteria have a cell wall. It's mostly made out of this weird chemical called peptidoglycans. The glyco means it's mostly carbohydrate, but has a little bit of protein on this end. So which is it? It's mostly, on most of it, it's a carbohydrate, but it has some little protein bits on it. This chemical forms a cell wall, and antibiotics work by weakening that cell wall. So the bacteria will swell, and then pop like a balloon. There are lots of different kinds of bacteria that live in lots of different ways. I want you to know what autotrophs and heterotrophs are. Some bacteria are both, but in general, things that have to eat stuff are called heterotrophs. Okay, hetero means not yourself. It's eating, troph means eat, eating something that's not itself. It doesn't make its own food. Good? So a wolf would be a heterotroph, right? A rabbit would be a heterotroph because it's eating the plants. What's the plant? It's an autotroph. It's a thing that makes its own food. Troph means food. Auto means it does it itself. If you think about it, nowadays we talk about car, what kind of car do you drive? In the olden days, they didn't call them cars. It was still a valid term. It's an A word. It's automobile. What that means, because when they were first making cars, it was like, oh my God, it is automatically mobile. It like moves itself. You don't hook horses to it. That's what the name meant. Automobile was the my God, it can move itself thing. That's literally what the name means. Well, this is the, oh my, it can like feed itself. It does it automatically. It doesn't need something else to eat. I also want you to break those down further. We talked about the grass, we talked about the plants. Plants, algae, some forms of bacteria, cyanobacteria, they do photosynthesis. They take light, photo, and use it to synthesize their own food molecules. You got that, right? Now, if you look deep at the bottom of the ocean where there's no light, and there's like hot vents coming up, or you look deep, dark in a cave where there's no light, and or deep in the ocean, not where there's a hot vent, but where there's raw methane seeping up, so dark, so deep, so cold that the methane is not a gas that comes up, it oozes up like this semi-solid bleh. You'll have microbes there that live not by taking light energy, but by breaking down the methane or taking the compounds coming out of the superheated water and breaking them down and using that energy to make their own food. They're doing chemosynthesis. They're using chemical energy to synthesize their own food. Are you with me? Does that make sense? If you want to see a really weird chemosynthetic thing, at the cold methane seep, I already told you have microbes. Yeah, we'll get past the punchline. All right. At the cold methane seeps, you have little microbes. They're archaea because they live in extreme conditions that break down the raw methane oozing out of the bottom and use it to make their own food. And then, of course, you have other things that live off them, like these giant mussels, clam type things. Ecosystem where you have the archaea that are eating the methane that oozes out of the ground, using it to make their food. Then you have the mussels that are eating the archaea, and then you have these polychaete worms that are eating them alive. So little things to know about bacteria. Some of them are round. If you hear someone say, "Oh, he has streptococcus, strep throat. He has a staph infection. He's staphylococcus." Cocci means, "Oh yeah, it's a round one." It just means the bacteria are round. If you, I ate yogurt. It had lactobacillus in it, right? You've heard that. Bacilli just means, oh, that bacteria is rod-shaped. Then you have some that are spiral-shaped spirochetes, like the one that causes ulcers, Helicobacter pylori, that's a spirochete. The other terms there are like structures that bacteria can have. The sperm, it swims to the egg. It swims to the egg and it's wiggling its tail back and forth, right? That tail is a flagella. It's just that bacteria may have more than one. But a long, whip-like tail, that's a flagella. They could have shorter hair like things called pili that they use to hold hands, that they attach to each other or to attach to a surface. And then a capsule. Remember I said you have a cell wall made out of, I'm looking for a P word? Peptidoglycans. Peptidoglycans. All right, well, some of them around that have a sticky layer that lets them grab onto surfaces. And that would be the capsule. Good? Archaea, hey, they're kind of like bacteria, but they're genetically different. And they live in some extremely messed up places. Hyperthermophiles, we already talked about, they live in extremely, oh, look, it's the same dang picture. Okay. Methanogens, hey, they don't have methane on the bottom of the ocean. Hey, we already talked about that. Halophiles, hey, they're gloriously pink and they live in Lake Hilliard. We talked about those too. Down with that? Moving on. Okay. So now let's talk about fun things. Things with a nucleus. All right. 4 kingdoms, all of them with DNA in the nucleus. Did I say that's the only place in the cell where it is? No. They've also got mitochondria that have their own. If you're a plant, you also have chloroplasts that have your own DNA. So there's a little DNA inside of a chloroplast. There's a little bit of DNA inside of a mitochondria, but most of the DNA is inside the nucleus. Good? Now, what things are inside of eukaryota, domain eukaryota? There are 4 kingdoms right now. The kingdoms are the animals, the plants, the fungi, and all those weird little things, and the algae, okay, the protists. I can tell you right now that the guys with the white lab coats who are testing things to see how related they are, they're already mucking things up. Because they can say, oh look, the DNA of the amoeba protist is more like the DNA of the chipmunk with the mushroom than it is like the DNA of the algae. I guarantee you within 10 years they're going to break the amoebas out to their own kingdom. They think that the plants are really closely related to green algae, which kind of makes a whole heck of a lot of sense because they're green and they photosynthesize and they all have chlorophyll. And
that's the one that we usually use, right? Well, which one is more fun?
Most of the ecosystems on Earth are powered by photosynthesis by plants. And most of the ones in the ocean are powered by photosynthesis by green algae. And then deep down we have weird stuff going on. For that we can blame the archaea. Good? Good? All right, so what do we know about eukaryotes? They got a nucleus. They got parts inside, right? In lab, you already went over a bunch of these parts. Who's done with all their parts of the cell thing? Good, good. Now this is old hat to you. You know that the mitochondria are the power plant where you make the energy, right? You know that the Golgi apparatus is where you take chemicals and you package them and you modify them. The endoplasmic reticulum is where you actually make them. If you think of the endoplasmic reticulum as a factory where you make things, you think of the ribosomes as the workers in the factory that actually do the making. Good? And then you vacuole where you can store stuff. Now, all of these parts are a lot more complicated than the prokaryotes, right? So everybody's like, where did those things come from? We'll talk about it more, but what we're going to talk about is the endosymbiont theory. And the idea is pretty simple. The idea is that, hey, well maybe you had an autotroph prokaryote and you had a heterotroph prokaryote, and it's used to taking them in and eating them. But it takes one in and it's like, that's making energy. I'm not going to digest it, I'll just let it make energy for me, and then I don't need to chase things. All right. It's a nice arrangement where This thing gets some of the chemicals it needs to make other chemicals, and this gets food from the little one that it took in. And so when it reproduces, they both reproduce, and presto, you got that going on. And so doing this, you have your eukaryote created because you have taken in the other, because a big prokaryote takes in little prokaryotes. It's a nice story. And some people are like, yeah, how do you know that? Yeah, you weren't there. Nobody was there. How do you think you know that? You remember I said we use the T word when we think something's strongly supported and we have evidence? You know, we're going to talk a lot about cell division. Do you know that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts reproduce and divide inside the cell on their own all the time, whether the cell's dividing or not? That's not the kicker. You know, kind of like you taking a little microbe and it's doing its own thing. So the real kicker is that, say we've got our eukaryotic cell and it's got our nucleus and we've got, say, mitochondria here. Double layer, the inner layer has these folds, we call them cristae. You know what this has? It has its own DNA. Most of the DNA in the cell is here, but it's got its own DNA. You know what else it has? It's got its own ribosomes. We've got ribosomes here. Say this is a bacteria. Outside the cell, yeah. It's got its own DNA and its own ribosomes. The DNA in a mitochondria is more like the DNA in the bacteria than it is like the DNA in the rest of the cell, the DNA in the nucleus. In fact, it's not just the DNA. The histone proteins the DNA is wrapped around, they're more like that. I'm sorry, these ones are more like those histone proteins than they are like those histone proteins. You've got something inside that reproduces on its own. It has bacteria-like DNA. When I say that, I mean it doesn't have a lot of introns. We'll talk later about what that means. It has the same type of proteins it's wrapped around, has similar sequences of DNA, and it's got a double membrane. That's okay. I've been bitten. Ow, he has teeth. Ow, ow, ow.